Okay, today we're going to talk about ad performance and exactly what do we mean by that. In our context for the discussion here today, we're going to talk about load time, the performance of ads as it applies to the load time of a web page, or the impact to the load time of a web page. Advertisers often use the term ad performance to mean something different. They mean the effectiveness of the ad for their goals, which is usually click-through rates or conversions or what have you. That's not what we're discussing today. So let me introduce the panelists here. I see we're not in the right order, but that's okay. I'll start on the left here as Artur Bergman from Wikia. Next to him, Bryant Mason, Microsoft. Next is Tony Ralph from Yahoo. Next is Samir Ajmani from Google. And then immediately left to my right is Richard Bush from ADTECH, which is also a wholly owned portion of AOL. And I'm Eric Goldsmith, the moderator, also from AOL. So some of the format we're going to cover today, we're going to start with some prepared questions to get us started and to establish a framework and a context. There's some visuals that go along with all that, and then we're going to open it up and take questions from the audience. And we should, by the time we get there, have a microphone for the audience. Right? Right. Okay. Okay, first I want to just talk about the advertising ecosystem. Who are all the players here? So we have the advertisers, the agencies, vendors, and publishers. The advertiser is somebody who wants to put an ad on a website somewhere. The agency is who the advertiser uses to actually create the ad, to create the creative and the material. And the vendor is actually the company that serves the ad, the web servers that serve the ad. And then the publisher is the page that is hosting the ad. So most of you here and many of the panelists are publishers, and some of the panelists are also vendors. Some of the larger companies are publishers and vendors. So just a quick word on multi-party serving of ads. So when a publisher serves an ad, they usually have an approved list of ad vendors, and those are generally called first-party vendors. Those vendors, in turn, can then use other vendors to serve ads, and those are known as third-party vendors. Most publishers maintain a list of approved third-party vendors just to control quality. Sometimes those third-party vendors use other vendors, fourth, even fifth-party vendors, and a lot of publishers don't allow that. They don't like it to happen. Sometimes it does anyway, but we'll see later that can cause some real problems with quality. So let's jump right into some of the questions here. I hear that web developers complain that ads are the main thing slowing down their pages. Is that a valid complaint? Let's start with Artur. And here's a visual that goes along with it.
Did I send you this visual, or because I can't really see it? I think it's true. There is lots of work to be done for developers, but we just finished a project where we cut our initial download by 50% from our point of view, but the total downloaded is down 20%. So I think around 65% of our page load on our smallish page is actually ads.
Okay. Well, this example is from an unnamed AOL website from a couple of years ago, and it's just showing the impact of, at that time, all the ads were loaded at the bottom of the page, and you can just visually see how much longer it's taking to finish the page load due to the ads, and the impact of East Coast versus West. In this particular case, the vendor being used only had one data center. And guess which coast it was on. Samir or Bryant, do you have anything to add? Or anybody can jump in.
I'll jump in if my mic is working. Is it working?
Yeah,
now it is. Yeah, well, I guess what I'd say is maybe the developer in this case, and I'm not going to try to be directly confrontational with all the developers here, is identifying with only one of their customers and not with the other great external customer that they have, which is their advertiser, right? So that's something that you really start to have to think about, is whether you're maybe over-identifying one side or the other. And in this case, obviously, there's clearly some problems, but if you think about ads as the bad guy, you're never going to really get anywhere, and you need to be able to sort of make bridge that gap maybe and try to understand your advertisers as your customers as well, because they're the ones who they're generating the revenue for you as well, in conjunction with the end users, right?
I'll echo that and also clarify something about ad serving, is that there's two major phases to consider, right? There's the initial part of, contacting the ad server, logging the impression, figuring out what creative is going to be served, and that may involve several hops at third-party ad serving scenarios. And then there's a creative delivery, which used to be things like banner ads, more recently videos, and now we get these very elaborate rich media ads where you get flash and flash, a container with its own set of sub-resources and components. And the Hotmail talk yesterday described a scenario where they had an ad that was several times the page weight of Hotmail itself. Yeah. And what really kills you there is that by the time the user decides to interact with the Ajax application, that interaction may still be contending with a prior ad load. So exactly, the creatives provided by the advertiser can be a real issue with these sort of load times.
Great.
So we take the advertisers into account in the sense that when we have high value ads running, we don't load them delayed, we load them in line. We remove ad units when we don't have high value ads running. We add more. So we do take that into account and kind of try to balance the user experience versus our revenue.
Great. Anybody else? All right, let's move on. What is it about the ads that make them slow? I'm going to kick this off to Bryant. And this is the visual you provided, so I'll just go ahead and drop that in.
All right. Well, this is just our visual about where the ads interact with your page. You've got your client-side libraries that are maybe used. There's a lot of talk about JavaScript. You guys understand how that works. You've got your ad server selection calls. Samir alluded to that. You've got your first-party ad content. You may have your third-party ad server that comes into play. You may have fourth-party, fifth-party, sixth-party, seventh-party. I mean, it can regress pretty far. Obviously the same rules that apply to your sites, the things that you maybe started doing recently or even became aware of within the past few years about geo-distribution, doing expiration dates, doing compression, all those good things apply equally to your ad network as well. And so these are some standards and best practices that the ad networks need to adhere to. They should be distributing their static content on CDNs. These all become issues about if they aren't, that's why your ads are going to be slow.
And there are other of the well-known optimizations that apply as well. Images can be crushed, JavaScript can be minified, particularly in these new rich media ads with all these sub-resources. They look a lot like little embedded web pages.
Yeah.
Right? And they'll have a lot of these same performance optimizations we apply to web pages will apply to the creative as well.
I would quickly jump in, though, and add there's also potential for implementation problems, right? So the folks in this room who are probably responsible for implementing the ads on your page, you really need to think about when, where, how you're implementing them. Are you using some kind of asynchronous call or batching call or something that's supported by your ad network? Are you doing it early enough? Are you putting off, like maybe the metaphor of this panel in the conference, are you putting off ads until the last moment, right? Don't do that, right? There's probably ways for you to gain some parallelism that can help improve the overall user experience by doing the right things from an implementation standpoint.
That's the ad networks make it really hard for you to do parallelism. I think part of the problem why ads are perceived as being very slow, because they always load sequentially slowly.
I would point your ad network at the IAB standard about asynchronous ad calls using the sort of friendly or dynamic iframes. They should use that.
At the end of the deck, there's a link to that paper if anybody's interested in reading about it.
I imagine you could also use the same tricks of multiple domain names. These ways of exploiting broader parallelism again apply.
Okay. An example of a slow ad. Tony.
Sure, yeah. This is it's kind of a treat for me to share because usually it's a couple geeks and myself looking at these and saying, wow, how egregious and absurd could this be to get to this state? But this is a Gomez waterfall diagram of a single graphical ad. It's not a rich media ad. It's a single image that's delivered at the end here. There are many and multifarious reasons why ads can be slow. This is only hinting at one. And in fact, this tries to hit it from Steve's first book. His number one point dictates essentially that to improve web page performance, you should try to attempt to reduce the number of HTTP requests. What we find here in this example, this is a case of a publisher page making a single call to a third party to attempt to get a single ad. What we find when that first request comes in is you can return one of two things. You can return a direct reference to an ad, which might be the ad is hosted on a CDN or a third party, or you can return an indirect reference to an ad, which most commonly these days is an ad network. Now, an ad network is an attempt to perform some real-time arbitration to optimally, join supply with demand, and that can return, in turn, a direct or indirect reference. So what we find here is potentially a cascading series of calls to indirect references, networks to networks to networks, as Bryant was hinting at. Each one of those stages can intervene and add their own instrumentation, and that instrumentation can be for targeting purposes, tracking, counting, surveys, etc. Further, they can add their own versions of those or further third-party instrumentation. So what we find here is eventually, in this example, the ad is delivered after traversing, I believe it's 8 distinct domains and 15 distinct HTTP connections for a single banner ad. Now, circling back to Brian's point, if each one of these requests was optimized, which I'm guessing they're not, but even if they were, this is still going to be a very painful experience for the end user. And that's only hinting at one fundamental piece of this. Why? Now, this is an egregious example, but it's made to bring forward this point that hey, we have to find a balance here between all this information and analytics we want to find versus user experience.
Right. Great, thanks. Why is it hard to make ads fast? Richard.
Okay, well, one of the main reasons why it's hard to make ads fast is just because of the dynamic nature and the real-time nature of them. It's not possible to cache and things with the initial requests because each party needs to make an informed decision based on maybe many ads that are targeted maybe to a publisher's website, for instance. And that happens in the case we've just talked through. It happens again and again and again. So it's one of the main reasons why it's hard to make them fast. Certainly in the initial call. I don't know if it's necessarily hard to make them fast because we've heard a lot of techniques for the last few days about making the images fast and making the actual assets themselves that make up the ad faster. But that's the main reason. And from a publisher point of view, they really need to make these kind of decisions about which ads to deliver in a very dynamic way. They need to make decisions about how much money each one's going to make them at any given moment in time, and they need to be able to change those things quickly. So they can't really cache things. Our friend at the end has his website has the ability to make changes to what ad calls are being made, and that's a very clever way of doing things because he has some more control over that process than most would. And I would certainly advise people to think about being able to make those decisions independently of the ad server and really change around the types of ad calls they're making and the process they're making. The format they're making, the places on the page they're making ad calls. It gives you a little bit more control than you may get in most situations. Particularly with a website like our friends on the end, the types of advertising they're delivering might affect the types of advertising they're delivering might affect the types of ad calls they're making, and it's really important to be able to make those decisions yourself.
Anybody want to add anything?
I'd also want to add that you have to remember that a lot of the people developing the ad content, they're not engineers, right? The people developing these ads are not engineers oftentimes. They're not web developers. They're working in a creative agency. So at least in terms of their goals and the people who are paying them, Coke wants a new campaign and they want it to look a certain way. They want to have a certain look and feel. So there is a certain educational gap, and I think also kind of outreach gap between what they're doing and how it then becomes part of our pages. We could really optimize and sprite everything that we have control over, and then there's some flash jockey in an ad agency, building something because it looks great to the advertiser, right? So, I would say from the standpoint of the people who do know how to optimize things, see if you can have a conversation with those folks or find some way to communicate with the ones in your business who are kind of related to that, especially if you do some of that in-house, to make sure that they know, hey, user performance and business performance, they both have the word performance in them.
Right. We've touched on this a little bit, but does anybody want to jump in on how we got here, how we've gotten to this point with the ads?
Yeah, I think one of the main reasons why we're at this point is because, you know, we've grown up in this culture where there's many people trying to do innovative things, and the same way as we have in the kind of standard web page building in the vein that we've been talking about over the last few days, and the standards haven't really been adhered to, or people haven't really maybe even had standards across agencies, publishers, advertisers. You know, there are bodies like the IAB and various bodies within the different groups, but not everyone's adhering to them, and not everyone understands them, as you talked about a moment ago, with even just the creatives having standards as well. And that I think there is the reason why we're at this point right now, because we didn't set those standards early enough, and I think it's starting to happen now, but we still need to keep pushing away at it.
Yeah, I'd like to add to that. I think if the question is how did we get here, we have to think about some of the immaturity of the web advertising model. If you're an advertiser spending a lot of money, you sort of know what you get from print advertising or television or radio. There's a bit of science around that. And if I think back right now, I can think of advertising campaigns or jingles or phrases I've learned from, whether it be where's the beef to the current, Geico advertising campaigns. But as a brand advertiser, what do I get as I advertise on the web? There's a lot of money around that question. Therefore, to attempt to answer that, what do? We instrument the hell out of these ads. In fact, there's companies who do only that to try to get a sense of what their user is doing, what they're seeing, how they're interacting with the ad, how this is affecting their attitude toward the brand. And that information is worth a lot of money. Therefore, apart from the actual ad, you have all this analytics and meta-instrumentation associated with the ad to figure out what's going on, who is it influencing, and how, to attempt to give advertisers some feedback on that. And I think the immaturity of the industry is one aspect of that.
And there has been a failure to communicate the fact that the ad load performance really has a huge negative impact. There's simple greed of publishers who put 20 and 30 ad tags on their page, and then ad creative people who just go crazy saying, if I put more wow, more flash, make this thing a huge interactive, special, flashy things, I'll get more impressions, I'll drive more traffic. And maybe to an extent that's true, but sorry to plug, but look at the Google model, simple text ads, right? And we are able to drive a business off that. Now that's not the only way to do it. Obviously, rich media ads, image ads have their place, but there has to be a balance. And showing advertisers and these creative agencies that these very heavy magic creatives, it's diminishing returns. You may not get the value, whereas if you delivered your ad faster, you might get more value. And I think that's a big hole in what we have, which is matching ad load performance to ROI and RPM, and showing that you make money by making your ads faster.
I think that's a fantastic point. And I think if folks here in this room can walk away from this with anything, it's that you have a role to play in making ads better, right? It's, can you draw that line? The MBA guys on your business side, they may not be, but they think they're as smart as you, right? And you're going to have to go to them and ask them, what is our monetization model? What is our sell-through rate here? Can I do some A/B experiments? Can I try a few things out? Can I show you some correlations? Because there's a thing called, page load performance. And here's how it actually turns to correlate with some of your business performance metrics like, abandonment or customer satisfaction or click-through rates or whatever they turn out to be. The business guys aren't going to learn your language. You got to learn theirs, and you got to kind of go to them and make a case for where those lines go in the right direction, right? And that's the hard part.
So what's being done in the industry right now to try to tame this and get control, Bryant?
Come to me. Well, Tony can talk about, maybe Tony, let's let Tony talk a little bit about the best practices first, right? You want to talk about that?
Yeah, sure. I mean, we at Yahoo have a lot of internal things going on, but externally we have realized, it's been emphasized through our sales folks, that, hey, as a publisher, we cannot raise the bar higher than other publishers. We cannot be a pain to work with. We cannot enforce practices that others aren't using. So at that point, we said, hey, let's reach out and try to raise the bar for the entire industry. And that's how I met some of the folks on this panel. And actually, Steve was involved in some of the very initial stages of this. We went to the IAB, which is the Interactive Advertising Bureau in New York, who sets some standards and policies across the industry. And we said, hey, we think that ad load performance matters. We think it's important. And we think that the pendulum has swung a little bit too far on one side, and we'd like to help bring it back. Our first effort in this regard was to form a working group, of which we have several major publishers that are represented on the panel here as part of that group. We published a set of best practices. That best practices has elements that are directed at, just as that ecosystem graphic illustrated, at both vendors, agencies, and publishers. And we say, hey, if you're serving ads, this is the best practices you can follow. Those are published on the IAB website, iab.net, and you can search for ad load performance best practices and find them. And I think we have links to them at the end here.
There's a link at the end of the document.
And the second stage of this group has been to attempt to, and this is currently being formulated, maybe we can talk about this if there are interests or questions, to try to develop an ad load performance scoring metric so that you could attempt to, as a publisher, know what the expected performance of a certain graphical ad might be, such that you could sort of dial in that revenue to performance dial according to certain pages you had. If one page you don't mind if it's a little bit slower, maybe you accept certain type of ads and you set the dial one place. Another page, performance matters and you can only accept the fastest ads. If we had a method to rate ads in this manner, it would allow publishers a little bit more liberty in that regard. So that's our current.
Yeah, let me talk about the score a little bit since I kind of threw out the algorithm to the working group and we've been kind of working through it. Is, you know, the idea is that we need to be able to come up with something that's independent of the ad networks, because the same ad could be run on his network, I mean all of our networks, right? And we need some way that can work in the workflow of the ecosystem. You know, the creative agency building the ad needs to be able to profile it and be able to score their ads. When it's accepted into your ad network, the ad network needs to be able to do something independent of whether it's been published or not, score that ad, tack that metadata on. Later on, maybe it can be used for selection, maybe it just really needs to be used for reporting, right? So that you can then draw those correlations between your business metrics and your ad performance, right? And that is something that we're hoping, you know, once we vet this and when we get some actual data on it, that we can use in a positive way.
And these scores and these ads best practices rules seem like great things to incorporate into all the tools we've been talking about at the conference. Why slow, page speed, etc. should be able to say, oh, I loaded your publisher page and here's why it's slow. And by the way, when loading your page, I loaded these ads. And this one in particular is really slow because they're not using a CDN, or they went through 4 hops to get to the creative delivery. There's no reason not to communicate to the publishers, and the publishers will let their advertisers know, you're making my page slow.
Great. Okay, what can an individual publisher do to prevent ads from slowing down their pages? Samir?
Well, asynchronous loading is one thing we've brought up, and that at least takes you out of the critical path. But the problem is these giant creatives and such can still have effects after the page is actually loaded. Individual websites having ads, and I think exactly the sort of pressure we need to make sure that it gets back to the creative agencies and the vendors and our networks to optimize the number of hops we need to take to deliver the ad and the amount of work it takes to download the creative, and ensure that doesn't contend with what is actually happening to the page. I think there's a space for some new technology here as well. These multiple redirects and hops that ads need to take in order to resolve and get the impression counting that's required is very expensive if each individual browser on the web is doing the DNS resolution, opening the TCP connections, 11 of them, 15 of them. If there were some way to aggregate that away from the browsers, we could get a lot of the benefit of aggregation and persistent connection somewhere else. And what we've been talking about most recently about web threads and browser threads, if we're loading a very large creative, we don't want your AJAX interactions to be penalized for that. And we need some way in the browser to distinguish between high priority work and lower priority work or background tasks. Right. And ads seem to fit very well into that model.
If I could just underscore one point there, that Bryant mentioned earlier, I've been involved in trying to speed these things up for several years now, and my trials and travails are much like Steve's happy and sad clown faces. Just to underscore what Bryant said, the small amount of wins that we have seen over time have been when we have gotten the performance community in the same room and on the same page as the business and advertising community, and that happens all too often. So what we try to emphasize is when we speak to performance groups like this, we try to explain what ads do, why they can be inefficient, so that you guys can get some ideas of how to make them better. Likewise, when we talk to the advertising community or vendors or agencies, which we have done, and several in New York and other places, we tell them about performance best practices and why those things matter. So ultimately, I can imagine a solution if we could join those two together all the time and through the entire workflow process. We have the opportunity for a tremendous amount of gain.
Yeah.
Artur?
So what we've done is we're not using the iframe method because we encountered problems with it with third party or third hops. So hops to hops. We load our ads after the content, but before a lot of secondary navigation that isn't needed for the user to actually experience the page. And then we use absolute positioning to put the ads in the right place. And one benefit we had, though, doing that is that we can now load the ads in the order of how revenue generating they are instead of where they happen to appear on the page.
Right, yeah, I think that's a very good approach. I think generally, if you can try and align the business kind of need for having ads, the revenue, basically making revenue on the website, to where they're placed and to the technical implementation of them in some way, by that kind of approach or other approaches. That's definitely a good way of approaching it. I don't think you can just kind of bung the ads on a page and expect it to work necessarily. You've got to work with the vendor to make sure that you're implementing things correctly, that you're not making silly mistakes. I know these are all simple things, but they can have huge impacts, and they're all things that happen too often with smaller publishers. Larger publishers obviously have it pretty licked, but it could still affect people's experience of your ad, ultimately of advertiser's ad, even on a small website.
And some vendors do support batch requests and bundled responses, so that if you have 3, 4, 5 ads on a page, instead of opening 3, 4, 5 connections, you're opening a single one and sending a single request for a set of ads, and those can all be rendered together. And then you get, you're fattening up your TCP connection by downloading more data over a single connection. So these are smaller optimizations,
right,
but still benefits.
That kind of approach helps with the speed, but it can affect the reporting, because if you're requesting more than one ad at once, you don't necessarily know that each one of those individual ads has actually been seen by a user. So you do really have to think about these things in the context of which one's making us money, because if you're delivering the ad to the page and it's never being seen by anybody, then ultimately the advertiser's not going to get any click-throughs or any results from the ad.
I said one quick point, though, just worth making, because these are all really good suggestions, but I would kind of remind people, if you saw Aladdin's talk yesterday, there's a kind of cautionary tale in there, and he told the story of when a certain ad got delayed far enough, they ended up losing millions of dollars in revenue because of the drop in impressions. So you don't want to be that guy that, because you were tinkering around optimizing things and you didn't really get the right evaluation, that caused your company to lose a lot of revenue or a lot of money. So, just make sure that you have a good idea on what you're doing and what the potential effect is going to be on your business metrics like impression counts or click-through rates, and that you've also made sure that it's still compliant with whatever industry standards or other compliance that you need to do, like IAB impression counting or other kinds of things, just so that you don't make a mistake pushing it the wrong direction and end up losing revenue yourself because you end up out on the street.
All right. Well, we're ready to take questions from the audience now. So I don't know what they did with the microphone. Oh, you've got it? Okay. So anybody who has any questions? Artur, I think you have some experience with that.
Yeah, we did documented write hijacking for a while, and it worked pretty well up to a point, and then we run 15 to 20 different ad networks, and at a certain point, there were enough weird things that we moved to the absolute positioning of CSS instead. Which
talk a little bit about some of the weird things that you encountered.
it had to do with ad networks that created iframes and then did things inside those iframes. And we had to override documented write inside the iframe, and then we ended up in a big mess. So I don't remember the details. It was roughly 10 months ago since we abandoned it. But definitely for the simpler ads and for our own ads, it worked well. I think the real solution to this problem would be, AJAX calls that don't rely on documented write from the ad networks.
I agree on that.
Okay, go ahead.
The idea of making an AJAX call to call the ad later kind of seems contradictory to the idea of loading the JavaScript to load the ads as early as possible in the page. So I'm a little confused as to what you guys actually think best practices.
I think
Because right now I'm actually using a similar way, actually loading the ad and then moving the HTML that the document outright is generated up into the ad, and that actually works really well. But I'm kind of afraid that my ad network's not going to like it.
Are you actually doing inner HTML or?
Yeah.
Okay, so that again, I kind of forget the details, but that does cause problems in some browsers with impression counting, which is why we use the absolute positioning of using CSS instead.
I was just really going to say it's depending. There's so many broad implementations. Whatever ends up happening is going to vary based on your particular context. When to load the JavaScript libraries. I mean, there are AJAX sites that implement ads, and they're actually standards around impression counting and ad rotation and things like that. So if you have an AJAX site, you can do things like prefetch and rotate in ads pretty effectively. But if you're still working in a site that's not AJAX based, you do have to deal with some of these idiosyncrasies, and they're going to vary from site to site.
And browser to browser. Yeah. Okay, right there.
Yeah, I think most people understand the value of having advertisers on the network, but there are some highly offending ads that cause a lot of damage that are very difficult to measure on a short-term basis. So one of the things I wanted to propose to the panel is the same way the pop-ups were eradicated from our experience totally over the last few years, is browsers block pop-ups. So we need to think of a way to prevent this scenario you showed where there are like 6 or 7 layers of redirections of ads, and think of a way to block that from ever happening.
Well, I think the performance score approach will be one way to do that, because we can make it auditable, right, where the ad networks become compliant with scoring as part of a creative acceptance policy. So you can conceive of a case where you have a business relationship with your ad network that specifies that you have certain performance constraints. That then becomes something that hopefully prevents these kind of things from slipping through into a production environment. And we don't have to be reactive about it. We can be proactive about addressing the performance problems with those kind of egregious ads, especially as they disseminate into other networks. But you can decide to say, I want to use this network because it's compliant and will respect the performance scores, or I'll use this network because they're offering me a ton of network and they're not ton of revenue, and they're not giving me any sort of performance concerns. You can make this choice.
Just to add to that, I think you're absolutely right. As an industry, we should put some bounds on the levels of indirection, as it were. And that does come up from time to time and is very important. But we should add that as a publisher, you are not, you do have some recourse. I mean, you are obviously dealing with a vendor or a third-party server in a lot of these cases. And oftentimes you can set limits if you work with them directly to say, hey, we only want, we want to add a finite element to this process.
That means it's worth for you getting involved in what your site's creative acceptance policies are. Help set them. Don't let just some business guy set what the contract is about what you'll accept from the ad network.
Steve.
Just fill in though. There is a problem that would be nice to get solved, which is when you get a report from a user from a bad ad, it's sometimes extremely hard to figure out which ad on which ad network on which hop it actually is. So if someone has a solution to that, I would love to hear it.
I think there's some push for universal ad ID and a few other things like that that might help there. Yeah.
Steve?
So I find the same thing with web pages, that there aren't that many people who start out with the goal to build a really slow, crappy web page. And I would doubt that there are very many ad agencies that start out with the goal to build a really slow, crappy ad. And so what I find is that a lot of times people just don't realize. And so, there really isn't a benefit to not gzipping or not optimizing image. And so I wonder, has anyone made an effort to go out to the top 10 ad agencies and spend a day every 6 months with their developers to evangelize these best practices and figure out why they don't have compression turned on?
Sounds like a great idea.
Well, you know this, Steve, because you were a part of some of these early conversations, but at Yahoo, we started to reach out to vendors, and now we're reevaluating that policy. And in fact, there's a bit of momentum now to do just that. We're calling it sort of a vendor engagement model to say, hey, Yahoo is both a publisher and we serve ads, and we're contingent upon other people serving us ads that we in turn serve. So we've enhanced our monitoring and our vigilance and our rigor at enforcing things where historically we did not enforce anything with regard to what they're doing at all. So we are paying a lot more attention. We're paying attention to the top 10 guys, but we're also paying attention to the 95th percentile, the smaller guys, because a lot of times it's the smaller shops which don't have a lot of those optimizations. So absolutely, I mean, that's something we want to do, and we've been pushing for in this push-pull of progress, one step forward, 2 steps back.
The tough part is going to be, though, that the ad industry side of this is going to move almost faster than we can from a performance side. They're going to be allowing people to build their own creatives. They're going to be opening up the floodgates, so it's not just going to be big ad agencies. You're going to be using ad exchanges, so you're not going to even know what ad network served your ad. So and targeting is going to expand to the point where you get 2 to the 2,000 n-1 kind of combinatorics. So those kind of things are going to make it really challenging for us to kind of keep ahead of that problem. But we do need to.
It seems like there's an opportunity here, again, for some sort of technical auditing solution, right? Where, as a vendor, we can provide something that publishers embed in their page, which actually does analyze the final creative that arrives with some small sampling rate. That says, hey, it turns out we got this ad. Here was the tag. Here's how we got there. And in the end, that creative wasn't gzipped. It wasn't compressed. We believe there is an opportunity for compression. And if that sort of thing can be automated and turns into an automatic feedback cycle, I think we can effectively get that communication to be very rapid and very responsive. And then, of course, there's also the simpler solution of, if you happen to be on the critical path of how the creatives get served, you can do automatic image compression on upload and JavaScript minimization on upload. And we see a lot of ads like that involve Swifts and JavaScript and images combined into rich media, and all of that we can do automatic optimization.
Okay. Yeah, go ahead. Well, I know at Google you rate the performance of the destination site for an ad.
The quality of the landing page. So AdWords has a quality score for the landing page, but I took a close look at it this morning to see what a latency is actually mentioned. It primarily focuses on relevance and the quality of the content itself.
No, not performance.
Not that I've seen mentioned. Maybe Steve knows differently. I think the fact that we have page speed released and the code.google.com/speed page is effectively communicating our interest in having latency be an important factor in the quality of pages. But right, regarding the specific question to the ad redirect, we need reliable tracking. And right now, redirects seem to be the mechanism that people in the industry standards rely on. Whether you could do something similar with asynchronous beacons, I don't know, because those are comparatively lossy.
Yes, it is. Yeah, I'm not going to disagree there. And certainly, you know, it's something that I know that at least at Microsoft Ads platform team has reached out to IE on some levels. But I think there probably needs to be, again, maybe like many things, some discussion about either industry standards or even maybe, you know, why doesn't the HTML standard make any reference to ads, right? Maybe we need to work there too, right? I would love to see the redirect go away, by the way.
Over there.
Yes, the vendor should help you make that fast.
Absolutely, I'd agree with that.
Or you should get another vendor.
Yeah, I think that's a good point. I mean, the vendor should be helping you with that. This is not new stuff. I mean, friendly iframes are not new. You know, this multi-fetching is not new. None of these things are really that new. They're just, I guess, they're just not widely used in some cases. But you should be. I think you should be shouting at your vendor and asking them why they can't help you with that.
Coming back to an earlier point, I'd love to see some of these automatic tools that analyze publisher pages tell you that advice as well, if that's possible.
Yeah, that's a great idea.
I would really like that because, you know, to a certain degree, YSlow and PageSpeed are kind of useless on publisher pages that have lots of ads because you get really bad grades without being able to do anything about it.
Yeah, good point. Okay, I think we have time for one more. Steve?
Mine's a short one.
Okay.
Is there any timeline guesstimate for this tool that's going to grade ads? Is it like a quarter, a year?
So I'll say that there's an algorithm. I think it works. I just got connected with some folks at Microsoft Research who were working on something very similar on the other end. They say they think it works as well. So at least in terms of that proof of concept, you know, I think we're pretty close to having that fall, right?
We're targeting October-ish.
Then it's really a question about how do we pilot it, how do we get adoption, and those things. Now, admittedly, we're talking about standards, so this is not quick fix engineering, but we've had a lot of support within the IAB from the agency council for the efforts. So there's no roadblocks there. So we just have to move forward and make sure that we have good supporting analysis behind it to show people that it is something that they can do, and then bake it into tools. I mean, Samir's absolutely right. So whatever tools they're using to preview their creatives, you know, we're using tools to preview web pages and analyze them. They're using tools to preview those web experiences to say, oh, this Coke campaign looks great. So now it needs to just tell them how slow their ad is.
And for what it's worth, I have been talking to Brian McQuaid of PageSpeed, and he is enthusiastic about the idea.
All right. Well, here's a couple of links that I mentioned earlier. The first one is to the best practices document that was published last fall. The second is a method for serving ads asynchronously, and specifically it talks about the friendly iframe method that we've talked about up here. Well, thanks to everybody that stuck around for this, and thanks to the panel, and that's all. And if you have any more questions, we'll be up here.